which means I am.
We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are gentle, angry people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a peaceful, loving people. We are a peaceful, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a peaceful, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. I just want to say, as you all travel back to your communities, to just take a moment right now to take the sound of this room into your heart, the look of your comrades, something that you learned, some emotion that you had. And when it gets discouraging and seems absolutely impossible, bring back this moment right here where you know that there were thousands and thousands of people who have worked with you over a lifetime to try to find what it means to be a peaceful person, what it means to be a person who works for justice, what it means to be someone who holds the weight of the horror and at the same time holds the weight of the spectacular beauty of what goes on this planet. And it is our job as conscientious people to be able to hold both parts and move forward with grace and dignity and courage, and you are a great example of that. We are a peaceful, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a peaceful, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. Thank you all so much.
Good evening. I'm John McAuliffe with Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee. This is the 38th webinar that we have done. And we're getting close to the end, and it's appropriate to have a topic that puts us in a larger framework. Couple of mechanical things. The chat will be closed until we get to the discussion so that that's not distracting from the presentations. But the Q&A is open. You can post questions there, and we will try to get to them after the discussion among the speakers and possibly some other VPCC people. You'll see in the chat box right now the link to get you to the bios of the speakers. Also, self-interestedly, a link that you can click if you would like to provide contributions, donations of any amount to help us, not just the costs of this program, but our effort to make this as a permanent resource available to people for a long time into the future. So basically, that's it for me. I'll see you again at the end, but I now am very pleased to turn it over to Doug Hostetter, who's a member of the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee, and you'll see his bio. But I want to add a couple of things to it. Doug is an unusual person in many ways, but one of them is that he's served three of the primary peace organizations, long-term peace organizations in America. He was the regional director for AFSC in New England. He was the head of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and then he was headed the Mennonite Central Committee office at the UN. So we're very lucky to have him moderating this program. Doug, it's all yours.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be with you and with everybody this evening. This evening's webinar is the World Order After Vietnam, and it is co-sponsored by the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. and the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee. We're very privileged to have two distinguished panelists this evening. Richard Falk is Professor Emeritus of International Law at Princeton University, where he was an active member of the faculty for 40 years, and a chair of the Global Law and Faculty of Law at the Queen Mary University in London. Falk served from 2008 to 2014 as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Occupied Palestine. And I was working with the Mennonites at the UN at the time, and it was interesting that during that period of time, Falk was never allowed to travel to Palestine because the Israelis violated it. But he performed his job very well and did get the information out. His most recent books include books written in collaboration with Hans von Spanik, Liberating the UN, Realism with Hope, Genocide in Gaza, Global Voices of Conscience, co-edited with Ahmet Davutoglu, and Patriotism to the Earth, written in association with Sasha Malanova. His memoir, Public Intellectual, The Life of Citizen Pilgrim, was published in 2021, and he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize several times since 2008. He is currently serves as the president of the Gaza People's Tribune, which held hearings in Istanbul last October. And in November, he was on his way to speak at the Palestine Tribunal and Canadian Responsibility in Ottawa when he was detained with his wife at the Toronto airport for 4 hours to determine whether or not he was a national security threat to Canada. He was finally rescued by one of his former students who convinced the Canadian government that he was not a threat. His former student was a former foreign minister of Canada. Then Chris Appy will then respond to Richard's presentation with some comments of his own and perhaps some questions of his own. Chris is the director of the Ellsberg Institute for Peace and Democracy and professor of history at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, where he received the Chancellor's Medal for Distinguished Teaching Award and the Distinguished Graduate Mentor Award. He is the author of 3 books about the Vietnam War: American Reckoning, the Vietnam War, and Our National Identity, published by Viking in 2015, Patriots, the American War, Remembered from All Sides, Viking 2003, and The Working Class War, American Combat Soldiers, and Vietnam University, North Carolina Press, 1993. He is currently working on a book about the Pentagon Papers, whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg. Richard, the floor is yours.
Good. Thank you so much, Doug, for that gracious introduction and my Canadian incident that caused me some distress. It happened to be my birthday, not the best gift. Let me say that I really welcome this occasion to be at least virtually in contact with comrades from the Vietnam era, and grateful to John and Doug for this invitation. I'm reminded also of T.S. Eliot's introductory statement to a New York poetry reading, which I attended, when which he started by saying that he was reluctant to comment on his poems, as so many in the audience knew more about them than he did. I know there are many with us who have studied and experienced Vietnam more closely than I have had the chance to do, although it was a very transformative experience for me personally to be involved in the anti-war movement and to have the opportunity to go twice to North Vietnam during the while the war was still on. The second time as a delegation of the peace movement to receive three American pilots who were held prisoner in Hanoi and were released not to the U.S. government, but to representatives of the U.S. peace movement. And I just, John McAuliffe called my attention to the statement of the current Communist Party leader, To Lam, which struck me as a very astute response to the period of recovery from the great devastation visited upon the country. And he gave a very convincing pledge, which would sound unbelievable in this country, of double-digit economic growth in the future performance of the Vietnamese economy. And even from Asia, that seemed like something of a fantasy until you realized that Vietnam in 2025 had a gross national product increase of 8%, which leaders in Washington can only dream of coming anywhere near. They have trouble getting within 50% of China's annual growth. So Vietnam has managed the challenge of recovering from what had at the time, pre-Gaza, seemed like one of the most devastating war experiences, certainly of the post-1945 period. We're living now through a period of gross uncertainty with respect to the future of world order. This atmosphere has been recently agitated by the Gaza genocide and the complicity in that genocide by the liberal democracies of the West. And it also is the current world order is also threatened by the uncertainties associated with artificial intelligence and related technological innovations, including in the waging of war. And we now have in this country still the most powerful country on the planet, a transactional and narcissistic U.S. leadership, which is not, to me at any rate, an encouraging way to confront these global challenges, ranging from climate change to ecological instability and to how to address the numerous crises around the world. It's also a time when a divided and troubled U.S. is uh, confronting a resurgent China and threatening conflict scenarios that are stimulating military spending throughout the world. Also, we are at a time where new modes of warfare are being introduced and dangers of war fought with nuclear weapons are increasing. So this is a time of world order transition from the end of the Cold War and US dominated unipolarity to a yet unknown future. And as Gramsci warned us, transition periods tend to be times when monsters appear. And his apt observation certainly seems to correspond with what is happening not only in the Middle East, but in our own cities in America, including the recent shooting in Gaza. I think it's important to understand that prior to Vietnam, world order after World War II was designed by and for the winners of that war. That's often forgotten when we think about the lofty language of the preamble to the UN Charter. But we should remember that nuclear disarmament was cast aside in favor of nuclear deterrence and a arms race with the Soviet Union, that the five most dangerous countries in the world, the winners of that war, were given a veto power over Security Council decisions, which meant that even if 14 of the 15 members of the Security Council were in favor of a constructive, peace-oriented policy, the veto of one of those five could paralyze the organization, which happened throughout the Gaza genocide of the last 2 years. And we should remember also that there were some very ugly things happening throughout and preceding the Vietnam War. One of the most, I think, consequential was the CIA role in the overthrow of the elected leader in Iran in 1953, not because he was an ideological ally of the Soviet Union, but because he had the audacity to nationalize the oil industry, which should be a kind of reminder of what's just transpired and is transpiring in Venezuela. And it was a period when the US engaged in assassinations of political figures who were seen as progressive or economic nationalists. The Arbenz leadership in Guatemala was overthrown in 1954, and there were repeated assassinations, including Lumumba in the Congo, of figures, political figures that were seen as somehow threatening to a market-oriented and hegemonic geopolitics, which the U.S. pursued as part of its containment of communism and of the Soviet Union, and reflected a very regressive view of political realism that has still holds dominance in Washington and is echoed by Henry Kissinger and now by Stephen Miller, who talk about the iron laws of history being ones that reward the strong and humiliate and defeat the weak. And that reminds one of the favorite quote of these people with these alignments, which is really very centuries old, but still unfortunately descriptive of those who make the foreign policy of the leading countries of the world, and taken from Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian Wars and the famous excerpt from what is known as the Melian Dialogue, in which the quoted words are, "The weak do what they must, the strong do what they will." And that kind of political realism is, I think, in recent post-Vietnam history, very self-defeating. We've been in a period where military superiority has not controlled the political outcome of the conflict. And Vietnam is paradigmatic for that kind of outcome, where the US had every form of military dominance, air, sea, and land, and yet went on to lose the war. And it's a lesson that can't be learned because of the strength of the arms industry and of the militarized bureaucracy. So we're stuck with a post-Vietnam search for ways to continue to pursue this kind of hard power geopolitics, even when it doesn't produce politically satisfying results for any version of national interest, though it does enhance the profitability of those in the private sector that are engaged in the business of supplying weaponry to conduct these wars. And that's a deeply unlearned lesson. And I think maybe by the peace movement as well as by the architects of post-Vietnam foreign policy. I think the lessons learned by the U.S. foreign policy from Vietnam, and by that I mean the established militarized bureaucracy of the government and the think tanks that line the shores of the Potomac River. And the principal lesson, I think, was of carry on with this kind of interventionary diplomacy, but do it in ways that avoid ground warfare and minimize U.S. casualties. Couple that with abolishing the draft and relying on a professional military, and learn how to manage the media discourse so the war won't be lost in American living rooms. And that means trying to devise modes of warfare that don't require ground combat. And the drone is a absolute epitome of the kind of post-Vietnam way of conducting a casualty-free form of warfare. Cyber warfare is on the horizon, and that's another approach that may be haunting us in the future. I think the peace movement also had the failure of being sedated to some extent by the Vietnam syndrome, what was called the Vietnam syndrome, namely the inhibition after Vietnam in sending Americans into combat situations. And it fed, I think, a game over delusion that there was no longer any need to be very vigilant about the way in which foreign policy was being enacted. And that overlooked this entrenched systemic character of the what I would call lethal partnership of militarism, nuclear hegemony, sustained by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, a period of predatory capitalism, and the tendency of political leaders and corporate entrepreneurs to engage in what I would call short-termism. They're interested in the term where they're in power of 4 years or 8 years, or the next report to stockholders for the corporate domain. And that short-termism doesn't correspond with these medium and long-term world order challenges that should be at the top of the policy agenda, but are marginalized by these short-term preoccupations, as we've seen during the Gaza genocide recently, where climate change is really, of course, it's also a product of a president that denies that the issue exists. I admit that it's sort of strange to be talking about global warming when half the country is struggling with one of the worst storms, winter storms in American history. But the underlying trend, supported by a strong scientific consensus, is that if we don't act quickly, we'll pay an enormous ecological and lifestyle cost. So let me now turn to what I would call the major developments since the end of the Vietnam War. And I think one of them that hasn't been given enough attention is the increasing reliance on economic warfare against adversaries, principally through sanctions broadly applied for years, sometimes decades, as is the case with Cuba, and coupled with various forms of political destabilization. The current Iran protest movement is a perfect illustration of where a regime that is antagonistic to Israel and the United States is demonized for its economic failures, which were the very objective of these economic sanctions. And rather than celebrating the success of the sanctions, it seems more tactically efficient to blame the regime for not being able to cope with the needs of its people, and therefore legitimizing a opposition, and possibly, it's hard to get the real facts of this protest, and according to some reports, engaged in heavy arming of the protesters, which is rather contrary to the idea that it is the regime that is responsible totally for the violence and brutality that has been unleashed there in Iran. This vision of continuing a coercive leadership with 1,000 bases situated around military bases situated around the world and navies on every ocean is really a repudiation of the vision of a post-Cold War world that Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader, tried to project of a enhanced global security system that embraced not only Europe but Russia, end of sort of an opposing military alliances. What NATO is doing decades after the end of the Cold War, it should not be a mystery, but it's certainly a display of the continuity of this geopolitical mode of behaving, which is not necessarily a negative feature of world order, but when it's so imprudently and belligerently carried out, it becomes the recipe for disaster. And we've seen repetitions of this disaster and repetitions of the Vietnam experience itself in these neocon sponsored state building interventions, such as Afghanistan and Iraq, Libya. All of them have failed to produce either market-oriented economies or constitutionally respectable political orders. And they've left the society in a worse condition than the supposedly benevolent interventions were advertised to achieve. And we witness this process in a number of different places where instead of state building, which is part of the claim and pushed a lot by Israel in the Middle East and countries like Syria and Lebanon and, of course, Iran, it's state destroying when it enters in these where the shock and awe scenario that was enacted in the 2003 war. Again, not causing many casualties on the American side, but great devastation and suffering accentuated by U.S. sanctions that were maintained for 12 years. And again, one of the features of this post-Vietnam world order is the attractiveness of proxy wars. You don't fight Russia directly, but you fight Russia in Ukraine, where the body bags are Ukrainian, not American. But it's a geopolitical war against Russia and the apparent challenge that Russia posed by attacking Ukraine to the ambitions of the NATO alliance to move steadily eastward. There is also, I think, forgotten the extent to which Huntington's Clash of Civilizations has guided post-Vietnam policy. And this has been evident, I think, especially in the Middle East, where all of countries aligned with Israel are from the White West, and all the partisans of the Palestinian struggle are from the Islamic world, and particularly from Iran and from popular movements in Iraq and Lebanon and elsewhere in the region. And so Israel has been assigned the task of doing the dirty work of Western civilization to sustain. See, it's not just a matter of Zionist skill at lobbying. It's also a rather sinister extension of containment thinking directed not at a particular country, but at a antagonistic civilization. So it's a form of what I would call Islamophobic geopolitics. And it has this civilizational unity that is beginning because of the excesses of Trump's American transactionalism. It's actually producing cleavages in this Western civilizational posture toward the former colonial world and the global South and generally. So it's a matter of seeing what will happen in the aftermath of this present period and whether there is a transition to something new. I think two other points I'd like to make about the post-Vietnam world order. One is signaled by the U.S. hostility toward and withdrawal from internationalism, starting this year by withdrawing from no less than 66 international institutions, including 31 within the UN system, and a broader challenge to the UN as the core institution of cooperative arrangements within the world system. And for the US to withdraw from the Climate Change Framework Convention, the WHO and UNESCO, the three of the things that it is, and the Human Rights Council, is to suggest a really self-destructing animus in Washington. We just had the COVID-19 pandemic, and to discard the WHO in the aftermath seems like a crazy, semi-suicidal kind of ideological gesture. And also, I would mention the rise of authoritarianism throughout the world, including in some formerly democratic major countries, the decline of the rule of law, and a series of disturbing developments. Who would have expected the ultra-right to win an electoral victory in Chile, for example, the country of the Pinochet repressive politics, and other countries in Latin America have a shaky kind of political future. And there's a lot of potential for conflict with China in Latin America because of the degree to which China has engaged in its form of economic diplomacy of building infrastructure for governments. It's building the largest port in the hemisphere for Peru. And this doesn't please our president, who has enunciated American hemispheric preeminence in this U.S. national security strategy text that was released in 2025. And among other things, proposes that no country other than the U.S. has any authority in the Western Hemisphere, and this has made the Canadians nervous. because it's phrased in hemispheric terms, not just directed at Latin America. So let me end by saying that it's a complicated, uncertain world where the future is hidden beneath a foggy crystal ball, and it's very hazardous to predict whether we will manage this transition in ways that will produce some kind of global future that is deserved by future generations and deserved by the peoples of the world. But we're now gripped by a very destructive set of tendencies that make me rely on this uncertainty as an antidote to succumbing to public gloom. And unless we have faith in some sense that a humane future is possible, we are likely to invite a posture of a passive posture, which will allow the well-organized worst tendencies to prevail. So I'm hopeful that what inspired the anti-war movement in the Vietnam period will inspire us in this challenge posed by the Trump presidency and the MAGA movement.
Thank you very much, Richard. Now we'll have some time for Chris to respond to that. And following this, there will be an opportunity for anyone in the digital audience to submit questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Richard, for those really insightful comments, most of which I agree with. So I really only want to kind of underline and extend some of them. I'll start by saying that this term world order is so grandiose. I don't know that we've ever had anything but really world disorder. Though taking up your hopeful note at the end, we probably should strive for a world order that's never been achieved. That's one that is based on peace and reciprocity and diplomacy and equality among nations. And there are some institutions that could serve that. And so I do share some of your concern about the United States in recent years dropping out of those. But I have to say that one of the most annoying things about the major media coverage of the Trump administration is to suggest quite explicitly that he is breaking away from this honorable tradition of America's standing up for a rules-based international order, or to quote the New York Times directly, he overturned a system by which the United States had been defending other countries against foreign aggression. That's their description of the last, 70 years of American foreign policy, which, particularly I think this audience knows is just outrageous. We've acted as a rogue nation, waging, as you ticked off, some of the overthrows of democratically elected governments in Iran and Guatemala and Chile in '73, as well as outright wars of aggression in Vietnam and Iraq. Yeah, I think it needs to be said, and this group I think will agree, is that the anti-war movement that arose out of Vietnam was certainly the most vibrant, diverse, and sustained anti-war movement in our history. And we would be well served to get to recobble together a movement of that strength and ally it with other movements as well, which I think younger activists I know seem to intuitively grasp that we can't just focus on single issues, that what's going on in Gaza is also connected to struggles for economic and environmental justice and other kinds of domestic and foreign peace movements. I have to say that generation of lifelong activists as a part of this audience must have great pain and regret about the degree to which American foreign policy hasn't changed in the decades, significantly in the decades after Vietnam. Aside maybe from this tendency to at least for 25 years after Vietnam, to not put so many troops on the ground in various places and to rely on proxy wars or small wars. But after 9/11, there are so many really troubling commonalities with Vietnam. Once again, in Iraq and Afghanistan, as in Vietnam, we waged undeclared wars on false pretext. We deployed troops to faraway countries where they were many troops, hundreds of thousands of troops to faraway countries where they were widely perceived as hostile invaders. They were given this impossible mission of propping up governments that didn't have the broad support of their own people. They were engaged in brutal counter-insurgencies that guaranteed that many civilians would be maimed, killed, and displaced. In all of those cases, then and more recently, those wars went on long after the American public had come to the conclusion that they were at least mistaken and even immoral. And in all those cases, the US government failed to achieve its stated objectives. So I think many things have to change if we are to dismantle this sort of imperial militarism and to create a more democratic and peaceful foreign policy, which I think the many Americans in the wake of Vietnam, not just those who were like full-time activists, did seek a foreign policy that was more democratic, more transparent, more accountable, less interventionist, more restrained, all of these good things. But unfortunately, those in power, and not just the conservative Republicans, but especially them, tried really, I think, to cobble together again things that at least people like Reagan believed had been destroyed by Vietnam. Pride, patriotism, power, especially, and international prestige. And one of the, I think at the heart of that restoration project, I believe, was an effort to revive a broad faith in American exceptionalism, which had been challenged to a greater degree in our history by the Vietnam War. This idea that the United States is an indispensable and invincible force for good in the world, which is at the heart of American exceptionalism, was fundamentally challenged by the experience in Vietnam and rejected by many. But in the decades since, there has been this, unfortunately, quite successful effort to cobble together a new form of American exceptionalism, which in some ways is a more distressing form. The idea of American superiority in the late 50s and 60s was dangerous and imperialistic, of course, but it was also universalistic and idealistic and based on a belief that the rest of the country would want to emulate our values. But after Vietnam, I think we developed this culture of what I call a culture of victimhood, which increasingly sees the United States as the victim of a kind of irrational and fanatical foreign threats, epitomized by, I think in some ways Trump is the culmination of a decades-long sense of that victimhood. I mean, every day he talks about the illegitimate lies and attacks against him, and justifies his effort to use unlimited power to go after his perceived enemies at home and abroad. So again, for many years we've been I think, moving in a direction that pits the entire world in some sense, certainly the non-white world, as real or potential enemies of the United States. So there is, in this new form of American exception, certainly a kind of white nationalism underlying it. To connect to Vietnam again, I think one of the strategies that this movement relied upon was to demonize, with some success, this great, vibrant anti-Vietnam War movement, and to caricature it as a group that, at the same time, as a group basically of cowardly, selfish, craven, draft dodging, unpatriotic Americans who like nothing better than to demonize and attack and even spit upon Vietnam veterans. We had, really beginning in the 80s, the effort to resurrect a view of Vietnam veterans as kind of heroic victims, patriotic victims, and that works perfectly to sort of stifle and discourage anti-war activism, to the extent that you can convince the American public that to criticize American foreign policy is to discredit American soldiers and deny them the support their patriotism deserves. That can be, and I think it was thought of in those terms, so strategic terms. So the anti-war movement of the 21st century has been careful always to distinguish the war from the warriors, maybe too careful, and and has really never achieved the level of breadth of movement as we experienced in the 60s and 70s. I mean, we do have an extraordinary amount of anti-war opinion. I think over the last 50 years, the public has been much less hawkish than our leaders, but we don't yet have as broad an anti-war culture and movement as was present in those days. I also think that fear-mongering has a long tradition, in America, going back to the Red Scares and all kinds of other things. But it's reached new heights in the years after 9/11. The world is a dangerous place, and America's mission is to protect people from these hyperbolic threats. I mean, you have a far greater chance of dying at the hands of a domestic terrorist than a foreign terrorist. Certainly a higher chance of being killed by an American gun rather than a foreign gun or an American automobile. So this fear-mongering is a very troubling aspect of our time. I also want to reinforce something Dick said about maybe the less obvious forms of America's effort to assert hegemony, economic sanctions. Last year, the British medical journal, highly regarded, The Lancet, published a global health report in which that study concluded that over the last 50 years, 28 million people have died as the result of American sanctions, which is an extraordinary figure. I mean, other countries besides the US does impose sanctions, but no one imposes as many as we do. I would just say to wrap up, because I really want to turn it over, that again, with Dick's final kind of hopeful moment, I do think that history can surprise us. It's not inevitable. Things don't always go in the same direction. Nobody in the early 80s was imagining that the Soviet Union would implode by the end of the decade, basically, or that a guy named Nelson Mandela would not only get out of prison, but would come to lead his country. So sometimes darkest before the dawn, I am energized and emboldened by students of mine, some I'm very close to, who are willing to go to prison in solidarity with the people of Palestine. The many other examples. So let's turn it over to any members of the VPCC who might want to say a word, and then we can open it up to Doug can find some questions that he wants to pose. Thank you.
So why don't we give Richard a chance to respond to your response to his, and then we will open things up a little further.
Well, I thank you very much for those comments, Chris, and I really have no differences of any significance with what you were arguing. I do think the one thing that is very important is the lobbying effectiveness of the private sector military arms industries. And I think that there's no counter to that. When these lobbies work extremely well, when they're well funded and there's no other side, because the politicians have nothing to gain politically by opposing the lobbyists and a lot to lose in terms of their career and even their future employment prospects. So I think we have to, it's really a updating of Eisenhower's military industrial complex. We shouldn't forget that important fusion of the Pentagon, the arms industry, and the corporatized media. That's a kind of toxic trilateralism that I think makes it very hard to change public policy. Maybe I'll stop there because I give others a chance.
Thank you. Maybe I'll take the prerogative as a moderator to throw in one question to start the discussion. If you could talk a little bit more about the weapon of sanctions, Chris pointed out how deadly that has been and how long it has been going on since the Vietnam War. We have tried to use that. There has been talk about the BRICS and alternative currencies and other options, which people keep talking about as possible ways to counter that. But it does not seem to have helped Iran at all. The U.S. seemed to have been very successful in destroying their economy right up until last week. Are there alternative ways, or are there alternatives being developed that can protect people from American sanctions?
I think it's a very important issue that you raised, Doug, because it's not well understood and certainly not well reported in the influential mainstream media that sanctions kill lots of people, especially vulnerable people, as though the Lancet statistic that Chris brought to our attention. I mean, it's shocking in a way that a liberal democracy would even engage in that kind of brutal policies that hurt the most vulnerable parts of foreign societies. And they've been used now in this Trump era against good things that have come out of the UN, such as the sanctioning of Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur, and a very brave woman who has reported truthfully and from an unpaid position as a UN appointee and is now punished. I mean, it's comparable, analogous to the punishment of the Palestinians for being allowing themselves to be victimized by genocide. There's a certain perversity in this way of dealing with truth-telling. And what we're experiencing in this period is a repudiation of the Enlightenment, both in terms of science as a source of knowledge and as evidence-based truth as a source of policy. And I think that's very subversive of the better sides of modernity, which really did privilege evidence, fought against prejudice and discrimination, and came forth with policies and innovations that were beneficial to people. And I think the overall Trump worldview is just the opposite. He wants to rely on beliefs, untested assertions, punish truth tellers if they're uncomfortable. They have uncomfortable implications for U.S. foreign policy. So I feel that's a very fundamental issue facing the country at this point.
Okay, I'll take one of the questions that came in over the internet. A question about the role of Israel and AIPAC in guiding American foreign policy, and whether or not AIPAC's influence has declined since the genocide in Gaza.
I would say that AIPAC is adopting a lower profile. I'm not sure whether its impact has been dramatically reduced, because, as I was saying about the problems of militarism, where a lobby is extremely well funded and not opposed by a contrary lobby, it tends to be operating in a political vacuum where its influence is very effective, and going against it is very costly. And I still think AIPAC has that kind of hold over Congress, and indirectly probably over the president as well. So I feel that there isn't much change that's discernible. It's possible that some of those who were very enthusiastic about AIPAC were themselves so alienated by the genocidal cruelty of Israel's policies since October 7th, since the attack on Israel, and are wary that if this image of Israel as a Jewish state and a rogue state will feed anti-Semitism of the genuine innate character and may favor a more balanced foreign policy when it comes to Israel-Palestine issues. But it doesn't seem to be the case at the moment, with Trump's Board of Peace being a real institutional atrocity.
John, you may want to select some as well.
Sure. And both Alex and Nop and Joe Volk have asked questions, and if either of them want to come on screen to talk about them, you should send me a note and I'll lift you up to do that, or we'll just come back to them. There was a question right at the beginning from Tad Daly that Dick, you might have looked at. He's asking that you say a bit about the intellectual and activist aspirations of the World Order Models Project that you founded with Saul Mendelowitz, with the presumption that there were alternative models to the Westphalian sovereign state system. What do you want to respond to that question?
Yes, I think it's an important question that Tad has long been advocate of more globally integrated governance structures for the world. And the World Order Models Project was a diverse project of the lasted for 20 years between 1970 and 1990. And it was also very much critical of the kind of Cold War politics, and the tried to seek, in addition to a peace system, a much revised new economic order for the world. Because the strength of the World Order Models Project is that it had participating groups in all the major parts of the world, so that it was not just a Western project, but it had Chinese and Indian and Latin American and African participation at a very high quality level. And I think it came a little too soon to have much impact. And I've been working with a few people recently to see if we could revive it, but the difficulty of funding these days has sort of discouraged our efforts.
Alex, you
Yes,
want
can
to
you hear
ask
me?
your question? Go ahead.
Sure. First, Professor Falk, if my mother, Honey Knopp, were still alive, I'm sure she would give you a big hug, and she highly regarded your cooperation with her over the years.
I was very fond of her. We
Thank
worked
you.
together.
Yes. So my question is, even given the fact that U.S. policymakers failed to comprehend before and during the war the antagonism between Vietnam and China, have you been surprised since the end of the war by the extent of the U.S. Vietnamese strategic collaboration on a number of fronts, including kind of a quasi-military cooperation and trade cooperation regarding exports from Vietnam to the United States? Thank you.
It's an interesting question of which not much attention has been given. I was told when I talked with North Vietnamese leaders during the war that they hoped for a period of accommodation after the war with the US, despite all the devastation and despite a really horrifying scene there. And their sloganish way of putting it is, we fear the nearby adversary more than the distant adversary. And then, of course, they had this terrible war just after the US made peace, in which, from the figures I remember, 300,000 Vietnamese died. And so I think there is a history of antagonism toward China as their neighboring geopolitical adversary. And it's somewhat, it is somewhat similar to the Russian fear of European penetration. You know, Russia's been repeatedly invaded by Europe rather than the other way around since the Napoleonic Wars, and even previously, of course, Hitler and the Second World War started that way. So I think it's surprising to those that haven't experienced that deeper history of Vietnam. But I was convinced that that was a genuine feeling. And Ho Chi Minh always had great admiration for what he thought of as the benevolent side of American exceptionalism. Vietnamese students, even during the war, were required to read and understand the American Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And so there was a determined effort, and it's one of the not often or neglected virtues of Vietnamese culture, that they, rather than respond with hatred and hostility, they tried to nurture a view that would lead to a post-war accommodation or a more understanding relationship. And of course, the U.S. completely misunderstood the Vietnam-China relationship. One of the things in the Pentagon Papers, which probably Chris knows more, I'm sure Chris knows more about than I do, but one of the early things is that the government documents referred to the Vietnamese as Chi-coms. They actually regarded Vietnam as an extension of China. And it was, part of the China lobby, and there were many right-wing think tanks and others that tried to paint the war in Vietnam as really a war of containment against China. And it's hard to I haven't been in Vietnam for a decade, so I don't know what the thinking is at the moment, but I'm not so surprised.
Thank you.
Good.
Oh, Volk, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Joe, both Alex and Joe are members of VPCC, so that we're asking other VPCC members if they want to say things. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, first, thanks very much for excellent presentations, insights. I really appreciate it. But I'm going back to the Vietnam era and outcomes of the movement. One of the things that was an outcome of the movement was the end of the military draft in the U.S. And I wonder if either of you might speak on whether that was a benefit to the development of democracy in the U.S. or whether a decline. And if it was the latter, and I say the latter because it's resulted in a mercenary force, professional military. Is that really good for democracy? If it is, tell me. If it isn't, what's the remedy? Thank you.
Yes, I alluded to this issue in my remarks, probably chaotically, but my essential point was that the foreign policy establishment, in trying to overcome the political defeat in Vietnam, blamed it partly on the mobilization of middle-class Americans who were drafted and had more impact on the media and so on. And so it was part of this effort to reshape the military dimension of foreign policy in a way that would not agitate the citizenry. And it was part of this deliberate pacification of American society. And many of the people who favored the war talked about it being lost in Americans' living rooms. And those living rooms where TVs were watching the body bags come back from Vietnam were primarily middle-class homes. And the idea was that if you recruited the troops and from the underclasses and minorities, you wouldn't and paid them, gave them careers, you wouldn't have this kind of backlash. But the consequence of that is that if you have this leadership that's subject to the military-industrial complex and its continuing priority of exaggerating security threats and sustaining the profitability of private sector militarism, it doesn't lead to a benevolent foreign policy. So I would say that the effect of that modification by eliminating the draft has contributed to the de-democratization of the United States.
Can I just jump in, Richard, to just
Sure.
tweaks? I think the military was freaked out not just by middle-class anti-war activists, but by the working class activists that were increasingly committing acts of mutiny and resistance within the active duty military and among veterans. And by going to an all-volunteer force, they hoped to weed out the possibility of a military that would disobey orders. The military felt itself to be in a major crisis. Close to being unable to field a fighting force and toward the end of the war. So that was one of the reasons for the change. And you can't have a draft that in theory is democratic and draws on every people from every class, but in practice, it was class biased in almost every respect and produced a working class military. So too does this volunteer system that we've got. So my own argument about that is if you want to bring back a draft, let's actually have Um, let's have democratic foreign policy and we have declared wars and that we all agree upon. And if there are occasionally just wars, everyone should sacrifice equally. That would be good for democracy. But the way it's working now, it's, as you say, worse for democracy.
Yes. No, I thank you for adding those comments. And it's not only the volunteer army, it's a career. It's a career for the people now. And so they have an incentive not to make trouble if they want to pursue this kind of career, and they may not have very good alternatives. So I can see the reason why a militarist foreign policy prefers to work with a professional armed forces.
We're getting close to the end, and I want to introduce a slight addition into your discussion, which it's hard to remember, but 2 weeks ago, we were on the verge of the breakup of NATO and the US invasion of Greenland, all kinds of dramatic things that led to extraordinary speech by the Canadian Prime Minister that I put in the chat, Carney, in which he raises the question of the role of secondary powers, and in a sense saying the necessity of the secondary powers playing a role, which I don't know if you have any comment on that and where that's likely to go in the near future. There have been some requests to try to get more materials from you about alternative approaches to foreign policy. So if you have books or papers that you want us to share with people, if you give me that, I'll put it on the bios page. The bios page will also have both the Q&A content, which inevitably is almost like a chat, and the chat comments, so that people will at least have some sense that what they've contributed to this discussion is being at least shared with other people who are now and in the future looking at the program. But at any rate, I would say if you want to talk about this secondary powers question at all, you're welcome to do it. And then I'll give you a chance, you as well as Chris and Doug, to make some final comments, and then we will close it down.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that into the picture, because it was a surprisingly strong repudiation of the Trump way of trying to dominate the West and dominate the international scene, and to seek, I think what underlies that is trying to seek a new balance in the North. It's there's nothing about Carney's, at least, background that suggests a globalist vision, but I think he sees this as a situation where an irresponsible U.S. leadership is breaking the solidity and coherence and probably, in his view, benevolence of the global order that emerged from World War II. See, I don't think he's not a critic, not a progressive critic, but he is a person that represents Canadian nationalism that Trump has, of course, periodically directly threatened. And Carney was being criticized in Canada for not speaking out. sufficiently. So I think this has to be seen in the context of Canadian domestic politics. And I'm not very confident that there's enough unity among the middle powers to do anything that would materially change the global order at this stage.
Chris, Doug, do you want to wrap? Any final comments?
Oh, I would just pick up on one thing Dick said about the continuing, in some ways, increasing threat of nuclear weapons in the world. We've made really no progress, even in the Obama years, on disarmament. It was a major issue for Ellsberg right up until his death. Trump's crazy threats make the risk of nuclear proliferation even worse, as nations may rightly think the one way they could maybe deter some kind of invasion would be to develop nuclear weapons. So it's something we have to make sure we continue to have on the list going forward.
Just to thank everybody for coming and participating, especially Richard Falk and Chris Appy, and the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Institute of Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., that has co-sponsored this along with Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee. Also to let everybody know that this has been recorded and it will be available both on the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee website as well as the Institute for Policy Studies website in a few days.
One additional co-sponsor was the Ellsberg Center. Chris, why don't you say a minute about it as one of the co-sponsors and what your agenda is moving forward? Chris?
Yeah, the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy seeks to build on the legacy of Daniel Ellsberg, whose papers are housed at UMass, and to work to raise public awareness, scholarship, and activism on these sort of overlapping themes of peace, government accountability, First Amendment rights, nuclear disarmament, and social and environmental justice by having webinars and lectures and workshops and a week-long activist in residence at UMass. So right now we're trying to raise support for this very ambitious program. And our website is just eipad.org, where you can get more information, see recordings of past events, and if you like, even give a donation.
Thank you. Speaking of donations, you may have noticed I did put our link in. These webinars are not very expensive in the sense that everybody's contributing their brilliance to them without any compensation at all, but we do have to pay Zoom and a variety of other administrative costs. So fun, and we do want to take, as I say, there are now 38 of these. We expect another couple before we finish this whole program, and then we want to get hard drives with all of, we have no idea how long Zoom will exist. We do have a channel with everything on Zoom, but we also want to seed copies, digital copies of all of the programs in as many universities and peace organizations as we can, and that'll take us some money to manage that. So whatever you can do would be grateful. The next program will probably be about the Coalition to Stop Funding the War. There is potentially a program about the anti-war movement in Europe. I want to do one more program on the music of the anti-war movement. And I'd love to do a good program on the part of the anti-war movement which was in exile in Canada. That is, the numbers of our peers that made that choice, and as a way of resisting the war, and then what happened to them and the impact they've had in Canada. So, but we do see this coming to an end as I face 300 boxes of files and needing to archive them and still wanting to have the energy to do it. And I encourage everybody else who's still on. We still have some 80 people online that if you have personal archives, try to get them someplace. None of us are permanent fixtures. We lost Peter and Cora Weiss and many other people in the last year. So get those files someplace where they will have an impact in your city, your state, or the school you went, or wherever else. And I'm lecturing myself as much as I am lecturing you about that. So we will let you know as soon as the next program is scheduled. Thank you, Dick and Chris and Doug. I think this is very different and a very fascinating program that adds to our set of efforts to reflect upon what we learned from the anti-war movement. So have a good next storm, which I gather is coming this weekend. Take care.